Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed, and this is our 36 minutes on antisemitism. Today, we are honored to welcome Tamara Berens. Tamara, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, please. My name is Tamara Berens. I am originally from London. I currently work at Tikvah, an educational institution. I'm the director of young professional programs there. But what I will talk about today doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the organization. There's a plurality of approaches to anti-Semitism. I am a writer as well, and I've been writing about the topic of anti-Semitism in various forms, both political and academic, over the last 5 years. And one of the publications I write for is Mosaic.
We are delighted to have you on the podcast today. I start with a standard question. I think I have asked this question probably 25 times as I recorded with other guest speakers. And the question simply is, what is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Sure, thank you. So anti-Semitism is often described as a form of racism or prejudice against the Jewish people, of course. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been adopted by 43 countries and numerous institutions, and the definition goes something like this. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And it goes on to give specific examples, including ones that relate to the state of Israel. So IHRA acknowledges both physical and verbal anti-Semitism, and it does provide a helpful governance framework for jurisdictions that have hate speech laws, but I don't think it covers the full picture. And as Harvard professor emeritus Ruth Weiss says, anti-Semitism is not merely discrimination, and it's in fact a political ideology. It has a goal, which is the subjugation of Jews and the elimination of Jewish power. And in the modern day, this usually manifests as the delegitimization or even the elimination of Jewish power, which is what we're seeing with calls to eliminate the state of Israel.
Definitions are very important, and I have to be honest, Tamara, is that with some of my guests, they were struggling to give a definition.
Yeah.
Some of them follow the guidelines of the intergovernmental organizations such as UN organizations, etc. And I will never understand why such organizations do not want to have a working definition. But as you said, and also highlighted by other speakers, is that it's really difficult to get to one definition, but it's imperative that we have a definition.
Yes.
This leads me to really a very fertile environment where anti-Semitism has been thriving, and that is precisely academia. And the question is, what is the state of anti-Semitism in academia?
Yes. So for decades, we've seen a shifting culture in academia in general, where speech is described as a form of violence, minority groups are treated with kid gloves, and there's a preponderance of ism studies, so gender studies. There's a resistance to genocide minor at the University of Southern California. However, Jews have been excluded repeatedly from this framework and from the growth in kind of activist culture in academia. And I think the situation is more alarming than ever post-October 7th, but perhaps I'll just point out 3 kind of key issue areas within academia that I think have really led to the harboring, or in some cases, the active peddling of anti-Semitism. So the first is the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic that we've seen emerge in some of the studies fields. And I think this really originates with Edward Said's text, Orientalism, published in 1978. This was really the key text that has gone on to influence not only numerous fields, within the humanities, but really beyond the humanities as well. And the text really painted this paradigm of oppressor versus oppressed that we've become so familiar with the West in this oppressor role, subjugating the Oriental, and with the oppressed possessing inherent legitimacy in their struggle for acknowledgement, and in some cases in their struggle of armed resistance. So this dynamic has been festering within academia, and obviously Orientalism is a text that primarily discusses the West as a whole, but I think its treatment of Israel, Edward Said's treatment of Israel, is really indicative of the specific issue with anti-Semitism that we've seen evolve in this space. So Edward Said, of course, would emerge as a supporter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the terrorist group led by Yasser Arafat, and Said would actually become one of its most prominent members of the PLO's legislative body, the Palestinian National Council. So you see, Said, who had a huge amount of influence within Columbia University, which was kind of his primary academic home throughout his academic career, also take on this kind of activist bent. So that's the oppressor versus oppressed framework. And this relates closely to intersectionality, which of course originated in academia, but intersectionality is a term that is widely used in activist circles outside of academia as well. So intersectionality is the idea that prejudices overlap, compound, and intersect with one another. So, things like prejudice against women, racism, all intersect and compound. Jews are often, in fact, almost always excluded from this, even though we know it to be the case that in most Western countries, including the United States, anti-Semitism against Jews constitutes the largest number of hate crimes against any minority group. So with regards to intersectionality, we've seen activism on behalf of Palestinians within academia become the norm, not only within fields like Middle East studies and sort of ism studies within the humanities, but also compounding in other fields where references to Palestinians, references to Zionism, of course, with Zionism being a great foe for academics that operate within an intersectional framework, references to Zionism and Palestinians will come up in courses that are not at all related to the Middle East history, the Jews, anything of the sort. It's just become an example that is used to kind of normalize the subjugation of Israelis and Jews within academia. And then I think the third thing that I want to talk about is academic boycotts, growing calls for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has been gaining steam over the last few decades since the early 2000s. This is really compounded post-October 7th, with Israelis being denied contact with American universities, not only in the humanities fields, but also in science as well. And this is a very worrisome trend, of course, that will only serve to distance Israelis from academic institutions and exclude them from the purported goal of academia, which is, of course, the pursuit of knowledge, truth, and progress. So those three things really concern me, and happy to dive into any of those.
We will get to all of these sections. It's important to really dive deeper into them. But let me ask, especially the horrific, terrifying events of October 7th attack by a genocidal organization like Hamas on southern Israel, which led hundreds dead, others kidnapped, sexual violence against women, bodies mutilated. How has this impacted or changed the situation on both sides? One is in the anti-Semitic type of academia, but also its impact on Jewish scholars, because we have seen examples where Jewish scholars were excluded and cancelled from conferences or participation in workshops around the world. how has this situation changed? But also, what did you see that told you this time it's different?
Yes, it's a great question. So I mentioned earlier the oppressor versus oppressed paradigm, and that sought to convince people that Jews were the oppressor, meaning that was kind of the main goal of that paradigm within academia. What October 7th showed us, at least for Jewish people, was a historic day of victimization for the Jewish people, for the modern state of Israel. It was the largest loss of life on a single day since the Holocaust. Of course, you mentioned the 1,200 Israelis that were murdered, raped, brutalized, burnt alive, and there are still over 100 Israelis being held by Hamas, both alive and some tragically believed to be dead. So this was a turning point for the Jewish people, and I think also a turning point for the lens through which academia views the Jewish people, because not only was it no longer the paradigm of oppressor versus oppressed, a sort of a benign paradigm. Now what we're seeing is the active justification of resistance to the supposed oppressor. So within academia, you have individuals like Joseph Mossad, a professor at Columbia University, the day after October 7th, writing an article proclaiming October 7th to be a day of awe and jubilation, rejoicing in this terrorist attack on the part of Hamas. So I think this is a major turning point with this sort of inversion of the oppressor versus oppressed paradigm, this kind of live example of, what Jews have been worrying about over the past few decades actually coming to be, which is not only are Jews unfairly tainted as the oppressor, when in fact, as I've said, obviously Jews are victims of the majority of hate crimes in the West. But now the resistance to this supposed oppressor, of course, of the state of Israel, is being publicly justified by academics with positions of moral authority. So it's deeply concerning. And just to touch on the point that you raised with regards to the treatment of Israeli academics in international conferences and the like. So Haaretz, a major Israeli newspaper, recently published a report that I highly recommend reading, delving into what they describe a potential new phase for Israeli academia, where Israelis are being excluded from academic scholarship and opportunities at a level never previously seen. And again, this is something that Jewish groups have been warning of for years with the growth of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. But what we've seen since October 7th, again, against all, common sense, obviously October 7th should have been a moment to recognize this sadly historic day of Jewish victimhood. But the inverse has happened, and academics are actively avoiding, refusing contact with Israelis. So, cancellations of invitations to conferences, a freeze on appointments of Israelis in foreign institutions. You have the rejection of scientific articles. There are professors that describe pitching articles to academic publications that they are used to publishing in and receiving excuses about, why they can no longer publish Israelis. And what's really concerning is, of course, human beings are easily influenced. I think it just takes one or two individuals within institutions who are afraid or who are unjustifiably angry or even perhaps anti-Semitic themselves to complain about being involved with Israelis, and then others follow suit. And we've seen really a lack of leadership within academia in standing up to these institutions. And because Israel is such a young country, although it's had a huge amount of success in the academic field, both in the sciences and the humanities, despite all of its success, it's a young country, and it relies on larger and more established institutions in the West in order to really impact change in the humanities and the science fields. And so I think this exclusion could have potentially catastrophic consequences for Israeli academics, and it's something that's deeply concerning.
It's not only the exclusion of Israelis and also Jewish communities around the world. There are Jewish scholars who are not based in Israel, but just for them being Jews. That's the only thing. The only thing that a university or a conference, etc., take in mind and say like, no, you are not welcome. But it's not only this, as you mentioned, Tamara.
Yeah.
What we have witnessed is how academia, and let me name it, left and the right, the both sides, the way the attacks were justified academically, and how they started talking about it, that this is what liberation should look like. What did you expect from a liberation movement? That's the type of violence you should expect. I mean, the type of justification, not only this, is that as the conflict continues, almost October 7th is being omitted from the discussion. It's no longer part of the discussion that a horrifying act of genocide committed by Hamas against civilians. It's no longer part of the discussion, whether by academics, I mean, even by big names. I mean, Judith Butler, for example. Let me name here. I think it's important that we name things as they are. Judith Butler thinks that Hamas is the power of the left. I mean, why all of this?
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. Obviously, Judith Butler, a well-respected feminist scholar, some would say a feminist icon, defending Hamas's armed resistance and downplaying anti-Semitism is deeply, deeply concerning. I think it really is the success of the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, which I hold to be incorrect, by the way, meaning I don't believe that global politics operates within this paradigm. But even if one does, let's say even if one believes part of the scholarship that Edward Said sort of brought into being within the humanities, that the West is historically responsible for colonization, and that people of color have been subjugated. The idea that Jews within this paradigm are the oppressors and the white colonizers rather than being people of color is something that I've always failed to understand. Thinking of Judith Butler, of course, within the feminist movement, within all civil rights movements within the United States, Jewish scholars and professors have always been at the forefront in fighting for minority rights. They've been at the forefront really in spearheading a lot of these new academic fields and studies that have enabled someone like Judith Butler to proclaim the kind of platform that she enjoys. And so I think really all of this can quite evidently be blamed and sort of placed with anti-Semitism, meaning ultimately this is the only rational explanation for why Jews are being wrongly tainted as the oppressors, and why armed resistance is being justified in the halls of academia. When in fact, October 7th was a historic day of mourning for the Jewish people. And we've absolutely seen, Jewish students and of course Jewish professors being targeted as well. And I think there's a real culture on campus where it feels as though the Jewish people have lost. And again, this is something that, the advocates of the diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks and the ways in which that excludes Jews, and the advocates of intersectionality, this is something that they would admit. In some cases, they do admit it, but by and large, they will paint their anti-Semitism, let's say, as justified by couching it in this sort of language of, rising up against the colonizer, rising up against the sort of white nationalist, with, the Israeli being unfairly tainted as the white nationalist. So I think there's a real culture within academia where, Jews and Israelis will continue to be excluded unless something changes. My one hope is that I don't know how this can be sustained over time, because October 7th was such an unprecedented historical event. I mean, it's still an ongoing event. I wish it was history, but of course the unrest in the region and the hostages are still being held by Hamas. October 7th is still ongoing, but it was such an unprecedented event and an unfortunate example of a success on the part of Hamas that I'm not sure how much longer they can sustain this, because they're so used to being in opposition, at least when it comes to global politics. That's sort of their main fuel, is claiming to be the victim, claiming to be, at least in global politics, on the side of the underdog, even though in academia, arguably, they've been victorious for many decades. But now we're seeing this sort of reversal where, unfortunately, in global politics, we're seeing, a plurality of young Americans siding with the actions of Hamas over Israel. And we're seeing Israel, unfortunately, existentially threatened by Hamas, by Iran and its proxies. And so I do wonder whether inevitably a shift will have to come on campus, because they can no longer plausibly claim that Hamas is the underdog post-October 7th. And logically, my hope is that their arguments will begin to crumble.
Now, academia, Tamara, is not limited to the academics themselves, right? It's also, it extends to other generations. We are talking here about students who attend the classrooms where they might hear that when talking about anti-Semitism, you are overreacting. Anti-Semitism is being used too much. And when you talk about anti-Semitism, they say, like, you are doing this in a bad faith, as if, like, they are downplaying the impact of anti-Semitism. And sometimes they also tend to forget what happened in the Holocaust. They tend to forget what happened in Poland. In fact, in Poland, to this day, Polish people think that they were helping the Jews. That's how they were thinking. They don't think that Jews were murdered in Poland. And they think that, no, we stood by them. So much denial of October 7th. And unfortunately, this is taking place in the academic settings. Now, how do you see the impact of this being transmitted to a future generation?
It's deeply, deeply concerning. So maybe I'll just point out a few specific examples of areas where this has occurred, and where Jewish students are unfortunately receiving no justice for the discrimination that they've been dealt with. So at Harvard University, after October 7th, obviously, over 30 student groups emerged with a letter effectively applauding the acts of October 7th, blaming Israel for Hamas's uprising. And there was no clear denouncement of this letter within academia. There were some academics that individually sort of made efforts to denounce this statement, but Harvard as a whole seemed to be siding with the students who were justifying terrorism. And the way that this ended up affecting Jewish students was that Jewish students within the halls of Harvard University, walk with their heads down, they walk with fear, and a specific student was actually threatened with violence by a Harvard employee. This employee posted a photo of a toy machete. He asked a Jewish student to debate with him about whether Israel was responsible for 9/11. And ultimately, this incident was not handled within Harvard. The student had to go to the authorities and had to file a restraining order against the employee who was threatening him. At Stanford, after October 7th, a visiting lecturer in a lecture with students asked students to raise their hands if they were Jewish and singled out the Jewish students within the room. One of the students was brave enough to say, actually, I'm not just Jewish, I'm also an Israeli citizen. And the lecturer purportedly said something like, oh, you must be a colonizer. And this lecturer was dismissed. He didn't have tenure, which is one positive step. But I think in general, there is a culture within the classroom that extends to the hallways. And obviously, academia is meant to be a vehicle for, as we've said, truth, pursuit of progress, knowledge, research, and ideally positive change. That has historically been the role of academia within the West. I would say that academia has been crucial in many American developments and America's growth as, arguably the most powerful nation, setting the cultural precedent for the rest of the West. But now what we're seeing within the classroom are professors who are, as we said, advocating for armed uprising against Jews and Israelis. And this is not something that just happens in a vacuum, especially after October 7th, with the overt violence that was witnessed not only in Israel, but then reverberating in Jewish communities around the world. And on campuses, Hillel houses, which are houses for Jewish religious practice and meeting, Chabad houses are frequently, spray painted with graffiti. They're threatened with violence. This is an ongoing problem. And the classroom does not exist in a vacuum. Students actually, who would think it, students actually take what their professors are saying seriously, and start perpetuating this culture outside of the classroom in the hallways as they interact with Jewish students. So, professors really have a moral responsibility to educate against anti-Semitism. I believe if they're unwilling to stand against anti-Semitism, then the least that they could do is be a neutral force and not bring up Israelis and Jews within the classroom in a way that actually harms Jewish students. So I think that's the minimum that we should be demanding of academia.
Building on that, Tamara, it's easy to say, let's start combating anti-Semitism, but in practice, it's very difficult. Whether it's in academia, on campus, online is another space where anti-Semitism is continuously thriving. And I think I have to mention this because I watch anti-Semitism in Arabic, while I do work on anti-Semitism in the rest of the world. But I have more interest because I feel that there's not enough attention being paid to how anti-Semitism is functioning in Arabic. A video was posted on YouTube of a Yemeni guy who was pretending to be a Jewish person with Jewish religious clothes, surrounding himself by the Arab leaders and using a song that says, "I am in control of you. Whatever I say, you will follow. I am the one who controls everything." A typical anti-Semitic type of slogans. The striking part is that YouTube didn't take it down, even after many reports. It started circulating even more. And what was really striking to me, not only finding it on YouTube, is that, as I told you, I am from Mosul, a city that was struck by terrorism. I started receiving this from friends in Mosul telling me, look at this great video of how, it's really difficult to think about, like, do I start with people who have not seen violence or people who are also engaging in anti-Semitism and they have seen the real face of terrorism? So my question is, Tamara, like, how do you combat this? How do you combat this? Especially when we are talking about academics, as you say, it's like their role is to provide rational discourse. And keep in mind that Jews are excluded even from the rational discourse. They say, like, you do not have a place here.
Yeah, no, it's a big question. And I can't pretend that I have an answer that I'm entirely satisfied with, but I could certainly point out unhelpful ways that academia is currently purporting to combat anti-Semitism, but in reality is only contributing to the rise of anti-Semitism. So just sticking with Harvard for a moment, obviously President Claudine Gay, former president of Harvard, resigned after a hearing in Congress at the end of last year, and she remains a professor at Harvard. So I think this is, still relevant to the discussion of academia. Harvard's mode of tackling anti-Semitism was to refuse to tackle anti-Semitism alone. Anti-Semitism at Harvard is now being combated in tandem with anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias. So they were impelled to create a task force to investigate the extent of anti-Semitism on the part of students and failures to protect students on campus within their institution. And they decided to create two task forces in tandem. So the anti-Semitism task force could only exist alongside a task force to combat anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias. And I think that's what we've seen from all too many legacy institutions, is that, the Jews simply do not merit attention on their own. Everything has to be put side by side with another form of hatred, the result being to suggest that anti-Semitism is not as significant as Jewish students and academics claim it to be, and that in fact, anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias should be elevated, at least to the same level, but if not to a higher level of importance. So I think that's deeply concerning. Of course, where anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias exists, it should be dealt with. But what we're seeing with the facts on the ground is a culture of anti-Semitism. That is what's dominating on campus. We're seeing anti-Semitic incidents increase tenfold on campus since October 7th. At minimum, almost 3/4 of Jewish students in the United States say that they've witnessed or experienced anti-Semitism, which is a huge percentage. I mean, this is comprising thousands of Jewish students across the country in all sorts of different institutions. And 75% of them in the United States of America have experienced anti-Semitism. We're simply not seeing the same statistics among Muslim and Arab communities. And so I think that when you look at the facts on the ground, the effect of this unwillingness to treat anti-Semitism as an issue that is worthy of independent and exclusive focus is deeply concerning. So I think that's my first recommendation, or the first goal that would really need to be addressed in order to see an improvement, is the willingness to see anti-Semitism as a noxious political ideology that is not just spoken about in the same breath as other forms of racism, but that sadly deserves to be recognized as the most significant and the most prominent form of discrimination that exists in academia today.
We have 3 minutes left, but I think so much can be said in 3 minutes. Let me take you back to the boycotting of Israeli scholars, and also just people associating themselves with Israel. There is immediately a pause. No, you are not welcome. How can this be reversed, saying that you should allow Jewish scholars to contribute, because you can not only hear one side of the story, you have to listen to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are conferences that are taking place across America for Palestinian scholars to showcase their scholarship. Conferences like the Palestine Rights Literature Festival, for example, which took place in affiliation with the University of Pennsylvania. I think that what we really need to see from academia are opportunities like this for Israeli academics to do the same thing, for Israeli literature, for Israeli scholarship to be showcased. I think that would be a very important first step. I think the second thing, obviously not all Israeli scholars are engaged with the study of Israeli literature, the study of Israeli history. A lot of Israeli scholars are at the forefront of science, at the forefront of the humanities, at the forefront of other fields. And I think we need to see leadership within academic associations in the United States, willingness to invite Israelis to participate in conferences, to contribute to scholarly articles, And I really do believe that leadership is something that can be achieved through the actions of a brave individual or a series of brave individuals. That's really all that it takes, as we're seeing from the success of anti-Israel activism. You know, if there could be a few brave individuals who are willing to stand up, my hope is that that would be contagious, that that would be successful. And I think that that should impact, you know, fields across Israeli academia and encourage Israeli academics to be brought back within the fold and rightfully given the place that they deserve with the cutting edge, you know, scholarship that we're seeing in Israel.
In 30 seconds, how do you see the future of academia when it comes to anti-Semitism?
I am cautiously optimistic only because I don't think that things can get much worse. I think that if fact and truth prevails, which my hope is that it will, people will come to see that October 7th was a historic moment of victimhood for the Jewish people post-Holocaust. That is objective fact of what occurred. And I can't possibly see how people can continue to protest in favor of Hamas itself, a genocidal terrorist organization. So I'm very cautiously optimistic only because I don't think that things can get much worse. And my hope is the pendulum will swing back the other way, with people with common sense reclaiming the narrative and just plainly acknowledging the facts that we've very sadly witnessed on the ground.
Tamara, thank you for your time and insights on a very sad topic where from something we were expecting more to be rational, but unfortunately we have seen otherwise. Thank you again for your time.
Yes, thank you for having me.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.